Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Settle in, dim those screens, maybe grab that one pillow you only use for naps, you know the one. We're going to be talking about a topic tonight that's just profoundly undramatic. We're talking about air conditioning. That humming, slightly too cold in the office, necessary evil of modern life. Tonight, we're going to trace the quiet, frankly boring lineage of how we went from fanning ourselves with a soggy opera program to having perfectly chilled movie theaters. So go ahead, close your eyes, ignore the low-frequency hum of your own HVAC system, and let's float on back to a time when people just sweated. You know, for all the amazing things the Romans did, like plumbing and road networks and conquering pretty much everyone, they really didn't figure out a great way to deal with summer heat in a city of stone. I mean, they had the aqueducts, of course, which are still stunning, but a giant water delivery system doesn't actually cool the air unless you stand right next to it, which isn't the point. They tried, bless their imperial little hearts. The ultra-rich, of course, had their villas built to maximize shade and cross breezes, which is the architectural equivalent of a shrug. Their most ambitious cooling idea was to run cold water through the walls of the home. Think of it, an internal, slightly drippy, water-based radiator running in reverse. This required an absurd amount of water and engineering, and the temperature drop was, shall we say, negligible? It was mostly a flex, a way to tell your neighbors, my house is so cool, I'm literally wasting city water to dampen my plaster walls. Because why not double down on the Roman penchant for excess? This tradition of throwing water at the heat problem continued for centuries, mostly because nobody had a better idea. In Persia and Egypt, they perfected the wind catcher, a brilliant bit of passive architecture that funneled air down into the house, sometimes over a pool of water to add evaporative cooling. It worked, but it relied entirely on the wind deciding to cooperate, which, is always hit or miss. So for about 2,000 years, the global cooling strategy was essentially pray for a breeze or move to the mountains. Now we have to skip ahead, quite literally, about 1,600 years, because nothing much happened in between except for a lot of sweaty people in heavy velvet robes. The gentle pivot toward actual air conditioning starts not with comfort, but with chemistry and a guy named Michael Faraday. You know Faraday, the electric fields guy. Well, he was also the man who gently proved that if you compress and then decompress a gas, it causes a temperature change. This was in 1820. And it was a quiet, almost accidental discovery. He was messing around with ammonia gas and found that when he liquefied it and then let it evaporate back into a gas, the flask got cold, like noticeably cold. This is the refrigeration cycle in its absolute least caffeinated infancy. Nobody in the room suddenly went, aha, no more sweating in my waistcoat. It was just a neat little scientific observation, filed away for future generations to use for the noble cause of keeping soda chilled. Then we float over to a very earnest American physician, Dr. John Gorey, in the 1840s. He was working in Florida, which is, even today, basically a giant humid sauna. Dr. Gorey's big problem wasn't comfort, it was malaria. His theory, which was a bit of a stretch, was that if he could just keep the hospital rooms cool, it would somehow slow down the disease. The things people believed before germ theory, right? So he decided to create artificial ice. He built a machine, a very clunky steam-powered thing, that compressed air and then piped it over a brine solution, making ice. He was actually quite successful, getting a patent for the process in 1851. But the sad, sleep-inducing truth is that ice delivery from the north was already a huge, lucrative business. The ice barons, an unexpectedly powerful group of people, just gently squeezed Dr. Gorey out of the market. Why buy a complicated machine when you can just pay some guy to drop a huge dripping block of frozen lake water on your porch. Gorey's invention was a technical success and a commercial flop, and he died poor and mostly forgotten a few years later. A classic, mildly depressing historical aside. Let's not dwell on it. The real, actual father of air conditioning. The person's name is still on the massive, humming box outside your office building is Willis Carrier. Willis, bless his practical soul, wasn't trying to cool people down. He wasn't trying to cure malaria. He was trying to solve a humidity problem for a Brooklyn, New York printing plant called Sackett and Wilhelm's Lithographing and Publishing Company. Because, and this is where it gets mildly interesting, paper is basically a giant sponge. In the summer of 1902, the humidity at Sackett and Wilhelm's was making the paper stock swell and shrink unpredictably. This meant that when they tried to do four-color printing, where you layer four different color plates on the same sheet, the alignment was always slightly off. The beautiful lithographs were coming out looking like a slightly blurry, tragic mess. This was an expensive problem for the printers. Carrier, who was a 25-year-old engineer for the Buffalo Forge Company, was tasked with fixing this. His initial idea was very simple. What if we just blew air over cold water pipes? This was a known technique, but Carrier took it a step further. He realized that the same equipment that could be used to heat a building in the winter by blowing air over hot coils could be used to dehumidify it in the summer by blowing air over cold coils. When warm, humid air hit the cold coils, the moisture condensed out of the air. It was a beautiful, elegant, and entirely undramatic solution. Carrier didn't invent cool air. He invented humidity control. The cooling was just a side effect of dehumidification. He later called his device an apparatus for treating air, which is, quite honestly, the most boring name ever for something so revolutionary. He installed the first unit in the Brooklyn plant in 1902. It was a towering, clanky beast of a machine full of belts and gears and ammonia refrigerant, but it worked. The paper stabilized, the colors aligned perfectly. The side effect? The workers were suddenly not sweating buckets. Carrier, being the methodical engineer he was, didn't stop there. He figured out a way to relate the temperature and humidity to the dew point, the point at which the air is saturated. He developed the famous rational psychrometric formulae in 1911, which became the technical blueprint for the entire air conditioning industry. And that, my friends, is the quiet, commercial genesis of air conditioning. It wasn't born from a desire for human comfort. It was born from a need for crisp, unwarped paper. The next big customer for this apparatus for treating air wasn't people, but perishables. Before Carrier, the only way to store meat or produce long-term was by using natural ice. Carrier's technology was absolutely essential for breweries, cold storage warehouses, and meatpacking plants. The fact that the air in these places was also dried out was a bonus, as it dramatically slowed down the growth of bacteria and mold. It was during this era, around the 1910s, that the term air conditioning actually started gaining traction. It was coined by a man named Stuart Kramer in 1906, who was a textile engineer, because, surprise, surprise, textile mills also had a huge problem with humidity making the cotton threads brittle and snappable. Kramer actually used the term air conditioning in a paper he presented, and it just sounded snappier than Carrier's clunky name, so it stuck. For the first 20 years of its life, air conditioning was really just a massive, noisy, expensive tool for industry. It was a business utility, like a giant metal spreadsheet. The big shift, the moment air conditioning finally started being associated with comfort and luxury,
happened in the 1920s, and it began, naturally, with entertainment. Think about it. Before air conditioning, going to the theater or a movie house in the summer was an exercise in masochism. You'd sit shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of other people, all radiating body heat, and the only cooling system was a few massive ceiling fans that just gently pushed the warm, stale air around. The whole theater smelled faintly of sweat and disappointment. This is why movie houses used to just simply close down for the summer months. It was their annual, necessary, sweaty shutdown. Enter the Rivoli Theater in New York City in 1925. This is the moment the technology, which had been solving paper and beef problems, was officially unleashed upon the public. Carrier, now head of his own company, the Carrier Engineering Corporation, was hired to install a massive system.
They marketed the heck out of it. The theater didn't just advertise the film, they advertised the temperature. They'd put signs out front promising refrigerated air, or more dramatically, a trip to the Arctic. The public reaction was immediate and profound. People would flock to these cool movie palaces, not even caring what was playing. The movie industry quickly realized that air conditioning meant they could now have a year-round business. Summer, which had been a bust, suddenly became the season of the summer blockbuster, a term that only makes sense if you have a cool, dark room to escape to. There was, however, one tiny little problem. People kept getting chilled. Carrier was a master of dehumidification, but he hadn't quite perfected the art of making a room comfortable for everyone. The early systems were often way too cold. Patrons coming in from 95-degree heat would be blasted with air that was sometimes in the high 50s. They'd sit through the film shivering, and then, inevitably, they would complain. This led to the invention of the 40-degree rule. Carrier and his engineers, realizing they were over-chilling people, did some gentle, sleepy research and figured out that the ideal indoor temperature should be 40 degrees Fahrenheit lower than the dew point outside. That sounds technical, but it basically meant don't make it a meat locker. They started dialing the temperature in theater lobbies and auditoriums up a few notches. This was the beginning of the subtle, eternal war we all fight in offices and public spaces to this day, the battle of the thermostat. Who wants it crisp? Who wants it cozy? It's a drama that has haunted humanity since 1925. For years after the movie theater triumph, air conditioning remained a public luxury. It was something you enjoyed in a cinema, a train car, or a department store. It was too big, too complex, and used refrigerants that, again, were often toxic and not something you wanted cycling through your children's bedroom. The Great Depression and then World War II paused the gentle march toward home cooling. But right after the war, in the late 1940s, the stage was set for air conditioning to finally become a household appliance. The key breakthrough came not in the massive industrial units, but in the small, self-contained window unit. In 1931, two engineers, H. Schultz and J.Q. Sherman, filed a patent for a small unit designed to sit on a window ledge. These early window units were still ridiculously heavy, loud, and incredibly expensive, costing the equivalent of about $50,000 today, so only the truly elite could afford them. But then post-war economic boom hit. Manufacturing got efficient, the clunky components got smaller, and most importantly, the development of Freon, or R12, a much safer, non-toxic, and non-flammable refrigerant, although environmentally problematic, as we learned much later, made air conditioning acceptable for home use. The real explosion happened in the 1950s. Room air conditioners became a symbol of middle-class aspiration. They offered genuine, private escape from the heat. The invention of central air conditioning for residential homes around this time was the final nail in the coffin of the old, sweaty American summer. And that, my friends, is how the desire for perfectly aligned paper, the need for preserved beef,
and the allure of a cool movie ticket quietly reshaped American architecture and human comfort, setting the stage for the totally air-conditioned world we gently drift through today. Now we arrive at one of the more profound yet utterly boring impacts of this technology: how it allowed buildings to become lazy. Before reliable air conditioning, architecture, especially in hot and humid climates, was an exercise in pure passive engineering. Buildings had to be smart. Think of the wide verandas of Southern homes, the massive eaves of Frank Wright Wild's Prairie style, the central courtyards of Spanish missions, or the high ceilings and transoms of older city apartments. These weren't just pretty features, they were essential cooling strategies. Then Willis Carrier and his colleagues perfected the sealed box. Once architects could guarantee that they could pump perfectly conditioned air into a building, they didn't have to worry about the sun, the wind, or even windows. Because why bother angling a window to catch a cross breeze when you can just crank the central air?
This is the gentle, tragic birth of the modern skyscraper and the generic glass and steel office building that dominates every major city today. Architects became much less concerned with local climate and much more concerned with maximizing square footage and minimizing construction costs. The glass curtain wall, which is essentially a giant greenhouse, only works because the HVAC system is powerful enough to wage constant war against the sun. The result? The standardized, energy-intensive, sealed-up box. These buildings are incredibly inefficient because they rely entirely on mechanical systems to function. If the power goes out, they become quickly uninhabitable, which is the architectural equivalent of putting all your eggs in one very delicate, air-conditioned basket. The most dramatic geographic effect of air conditioning was the rise of the American Sunbelt. Before the 1950s, cities like Phoenix, Arizona, or Houston, Texas, were considered barely habitable for large populations due to the extreme heat. Air conditioning changed everything. Suddenly, you could build massive, affordable housing developments, offices, and even shopping malls in places that were previously furnace-like wastelands. The Sunbelt boomed. People migrated south in droves. And this brings us to the windowless office building. If you were designing an office in, say, 1965, and you had full faith in your HVAC system, why bother putting windows in every office? Windows are expensive. They leak heat, they require maintenance, and they take up valuable wall space that could be used for, filing cabinets. This philosophy led to the creation of the interior office, the deep plan floor plate, and the rise of the miserable cubicle farm, all environments that relied entirely on forced conditioned air and harsh artificial light. This was seen as modern and efficient. It's a gentle dystopian thought, really. The air conditioner invented the office drone. Air conditioning didn't just change the inside of buildings, it changed where buildings were located, cementing the dominance of the car and the suburb. The enclosed shopping mall, a truly monumental achievement in 20th century American life, is completely dependent on air conditioning. It's a sealed-off environment where the climate is always perfect. These malls were almost always built outside city centers, requiring a car for access. Air conditioning also subtly influenced the very shape of the suburban home. Before AC, houses often had porches used for sitting outside in the evening. With central air, the porch became a sealed-off living room or was discarded altogether, and the attic became prime real estate for the HVAC ductwork and air handler.
Now, let's gently glide into the incredibly important, yet surprisingly low-key drama of the refrigerant wars and the environmental price tag. We mentioned earlier that early air conditioners used genuinely terrifying refrigerants like ammonia and ether. Enter the chemical giants, specifically DuPont, and the search for a safe, non-toxic, non-flammable refrigerant. A team led by Thomas Midgley Jr., a man whose other invention, leaded gasoline, also had a gentle, devastating impact on the planet, developed a class of compounds called chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. The one you probably know best is Freon, which was DuPont's trade name for R12 and R22. Freon was a miracle substance at the time. It didn't burn, it wasn't poisonous, it was cheap to manufacture, and it was ridiculously effective at transferring heat. CFCs were used in literally everything: car air conditioners, refrigerators, spray can propellants, and of course, home and industrial HVAC systems. Everyone loved it because it was safe for people. For decades, everything was fine. Air conditioning was cooling the world, and CFCs were quietly floating around. Then, in the early 1970s, two calm, unassuming scientists, F. Sherwood Rowland and Mario Molina, began asking a very boring theoretical question. What happens to these CFC molecules once they are released into the atmosphere? Rowland and Molina's research showed that CFCs were too stable. They floated slowly, patiently upward, right into the stratosphere. Once these molecules reached the upper atmosphere, the sun's powerful UV radiation finally broke them apart, releasing a tiny but highly destructive chemical, chlorine. And here's the undramatic, terrifying kicker. A single chlorine atom, once released, can destroy tens of thousands of ozone molecules before it eventually gets neutralized. Ozone, of course, is that essential layer that wraps the Earth like a gentle blanket, protecting us from the worst of the sun's UV radiation.
The theory remained just that, a theory, until 1985. That year, a team of British scientists working in Antarctica published a paper that didn't just confirm the theory, it showed that there was a massive seasonal hole forming in the ozone layer right over the South Pole. This wasn't some gradual thinning, this was a catastrophic, shocking depletion. The discovery was like a gentle, cold slap to the face of the global scientific community. What followed was one of the greatest and most successful cooperative environmental efforts in human history. In 1987, less than 2 years after the ozone hole discovery, the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer was signed. It was a global treaty, ratified by nearly every single country on Earth to gently phase out the production and consumption of CFCs. It was an incredibly boring technical agreement, but it worked. The air conditioning industry had to pivot, eventually to HFCs, like R410A. Now here's the final gentle irony. While the new refrigerants, HFCs, are much better for the ozone layer because they don't contain chlorine, they turned out to be powerful greenhouse gases, sometimes thousands of times more potent than carbon dioxide. The AC industry fixed the ozone problem but accidentally intensified the climate change problem. Because why stop at one environmental disaster when you can gently contribute to two? In the modern world, air conditioning has moved beyond mere comfort and crossed quietly into the territory of public health necessity. This shift is most apparent during extreme heat events, which, are becoming a regular feature of summer. Before widespread AC, extreme heat waves were deadly. Today, when a major heat wave hits, The local government doesn't just issue a gentle warning, they open cooling centers. This is the government acknowledging that a reliable source of cool air is as essential a piece of infrastructure as safe drinking water or working roads. This necessity, however, feeds right back into the next gentle problem: the colossal energy demand. The global rise of air conditioning is one of the quietest drivers of peak electricity demand in many regions. Think about a typical summer afternoon. The sun is blazing, every office building is fighting the greenhouse effect of its own glass facade. This simultaneous, massive demand for power often strains the electrical grid to its absolute limit. In regions like the Persian Gulf, the demand for cooling is so high that air conditioning can account for 70% of peak residential electricity use. The gentle irony here is palpable. We burn fossil fuels to generate electricity, to run AC, to fight the heat, which in turn contributes to climate change that makes the heat worse, demanding more AC. It's a truly boring, self-perpetuating cycle of planetary heating and cooling. And finally, let's gently address the subtle deception that lives right on your wall: your thermostat. Most people assume that when the thermostat in their office or apartment is set to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, the room air is exactly 72 degrees Fahrenheit. This is, in almost all practical cases, a gentle, comfortable lie. Here's the thing: air conditioning doesn't just deal with sensible heat, the temperature you read on the thermometer. It deals with latent heat, the humidity or moisture in the air. Air conditioning cools air until it hits the dew point, removing the moisture. A room at 78 degrees Fahrenheit with a low relative humidity, around 40 to 50%, will feel significantly cooler and more comfortable than a room at 75 degrees Fahrenheit with a high relative humidity, say 80%. This is because the drier air allows your sweat to evaporate more efficiently. If your thermostat is set to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, but your air conditioner is malfunctioning and not dehumidifying, you might feel sticky and uncomfortable, even if the thermometer says 72 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the gentle, technical truth of AC. Humidity control is more important than the exact temperature reading. Right. Dim the lights even further, folks. We are gently sliding away from the cool, crisp air of the 20th century and plunging into the stuffy, velvet-draped, and genetically complicated world of European royalty. We're talking about the royal house that made inbreeding an art form: the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were, for centuries, the gentle, quiet rulers of a massive chunk of Europe. Their motto was essentially, "Marry your cousin." This was done because land, power, and titles were property, and marrying a close relative meant the money, the castles, and the titles all stayed within the family's gentle, suffocating embrace. The Habsburgs achieved a level of genetic concentration that is truly astonishing. The most famous and, frankly, saddest physical manifestation of this persistent inbreeding was the Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism. This wasn't a sudden mutation. It was a physical trait that was quietly and consistently amplified by the relentless intermarriage. It manifested as an oversized, protruding lower jaw and a thick, often drooping lower lip. The gentle doom of the Spanish Habsburg line is perfectly embodied by Charles II of Spain, Carlos II. He reigned in the late 17th century, and he was the dynasty's tragic biological full stop. His lineage was a genetic horror show. He was the product of a marriage between his father, Philip IV, and Philip IV's niece, Mariana of Austria. To put it simply, his inbreeding coefficient was higher than if his parents had been brother and sister. Poor Charles II was a disaster from the moment of his gentle birth. He couldn't speak until age 4 and couldn't walk until age 8. His mental capacity was severely limited
making it incredibly difficult for him to rule his vast empire. His Habsburg jaw was so severe that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet. His tongue was so large that he often struggled to speak, making him sound constantly muffled and misunderstood. He was routinely mocked as El Hechizado, the bewitched. The final, gentle, pathetic punchline to his life was that he was sterile. The end of the Spanish Habsburg line was sealed not by war or revolution, but by a quiet physical inability to reproduce. He died in 1700, sickly and airless, triggering the messy, drawn-out, and surprisingly unsleepy War of the Spanish Succession. The entire sprawling, powerful dynasty ended because they simply ran out of genetic material that wasn't already related to itself. It's a quiet, cold lesson in the hazards of keeping everything internal. Let's gently backtrack a couple of centuries to look at the ancestor who arguably introduced the most concentrated dose of that persistent Habsburg jawline, and also happened to be ridiculously good-looking, for a short time anyway. We are talking about Philip I of Castile, better known as Philip the Handsome, Felipe el Hermoso. He was tall, athletic, and possessed the sort of easy charisma that made people forget about the subtle, gentle hint of that prognathic jawline he carried. Felipe was essentially a trophy husband. His marriage was to Juana of Castile, later known as Juana la Loca, or Juana the Mad. The union brought the vast Spanish kingdoms under the future influence of the Habsburgs. Juana, who had a strong mind and a fervent, perhaps unbalanced personality, fell absolutely, catastrophically in love with Philip. Philip, on the other hand, was a typical Renaissance prince, fond of lavish parties, hunting, and serial infidelity. This mismatch in emotional intensity was the quiet engine of their gentle disaster. Juana, consumed by a fierce, jealous love, would throw tantrums.
The political situation gently deteriorated. Juana's siblings died in quick succession, making her the sole heir to the massive Spanish inheritance. Suddenly, Philip the Handsome wasn't just a duke. He was poised to be king of the largest empire in Europe. But the real tragedy was just around the corner. While playing a vigorous game of ball, the 16th century equivalent of soccer, which of course they played in heavy velvet, Philip decided to cool down. It was a hot day, and he was sweaty. And in a moment of utter, non-refrigerated folly, he drank a large quantity of cold, cold water. The consequences were immediate. He fell gravely ill with a high fever, likely a nasty case of typhoid or pneumonia, and died a few days later in September 1506. He was only 28. The irony is simply exhausting. Philip the Handsome was undone not by poison or political intrigue, but by the lack of a basic understanding of germ theory and the unfortunate habit of drinking cold drinks when overheated. Philip's sudden, quiet death drove Juana completely over the edge. Her grief was so profound, so intense, and so famously unhinged that it secured her nickname, the Mad. She refused to bury his body for months. She had the lead coffin opened repeatedly to gaze upon her husband's decomposing, handsome face. Then she decided to undertake a gentle, bizarre pilgrimage, dragging Philip's coffin with her across Castile, traveling only at night. This wasn't just a funeral procession. It was a year-long, miserable, gentle road trip with a corpse. Her father, Ferdinand II, eventually used her behavior as evidence that she was unfit to rule. He had her confined, gently, to the Santa Clara convent in Tordesillas, where she spent the next 46 years until her death in 1555. Philip the Handsome, the fleetingly beautiful catalyst for the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, left behind a legacy of genetic peril and one of the saddest, Most gently melodramatic political detours in royal history. We've gently covered the adult disasters. Now let's drift over to the quiet, sad, and often short lives of the royal children. The first quiet tragedy of royal childhood was the simple, brutal reality of infant mortality. Most royal families were locked in a constant low-stakes battle against germs and diseases. Queen Anne of Great Britain was pregnant 17 times. Of those, she suffered miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants who died shortly after birth. Only one child, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, survived past infancy, and he died gently at the age of 11. 17 pregnancies, 0 heirs remaining. When a royal child did survive infancy, they were immediately handed over to a wet nurse. Royal mothers, especially the queens, rarely, if ever, breastfed their own children. This was partly due to dynastic necessity. If a queen was nursing, it often took longer for her to become fertile again. When the child was finally weaned, they were then gently handed over to a governess or tutor, and the queen went back to her main job, securing the dynasty. Once the royal children reached about age 7, their lives shifted from being physically vulnerable to being academically brutal. Their gentle childhoods ended abruptly, replaced by an intense, high-pressure curriculum designed to forge a future ruler. They were learning Latin before they lost their baby teeth. They were expected to be fluent in multiple European languages, study classical literature, theology, military tactics, diplomacy, and history. All of this was done under the strict, watchful eye of tutors. The pressure was immense, leading to a kind of quiet, emotional stunting that often defined their rule later in life. They weren't allowed to be children. They had to be small, slightly weaker prototypes of a future king. The one quiet exception to this rule of early death and constant study was the child who was never meant to rule, the spare. They often received a less rigorous education and were sometimes simply spoiled rotten until their older sibling died, at which point the pressure would instantly and violently descend. This created a generation of spoiled, ill-disciplined royals who, when suddenly thrust onto the throne, were completely unprepared. That's a wrap on the small, sad lives of the royal kids. Now, let's gently glide over to the curious, quiet history of a surprisingly non-sleepy drink, coffee, and how it changed the world's gentle pace. For centuries, coffee was essentially a gentle, guarded secret of the Arabian Peninsula, specifically Yemen. Before coffee, the standard beverages in Europe were either water, often contaminated and dangerous, or beer or wine, mildly alcoholic and therefore safer, but gently intoxicating. For most of the day, people were either slightly ill, slightly drunk, or just generally sluggish. The local population had discovered that brewing the bean created a bitter, dark drink that offered a profound, gentle jolt of wakefulness. By the 15th century, coffee houses, or kave canes, were flourishing across the Middle East. They became known as schools of the wise, or more gently, just places where people could quietly argue about things without being completely wasted. European traders, especially the ever-curious Venetians and later the Dutch, encountered coffee during their extensive trading voyages to the Ottoman Empire. They recognized its value, a non-alcoholic drink that made people focused and talkative. The problem? The Arab world was understandably keen to maintain a monopoly on the production of coffee. Every coffee bean that left the port of Mocha, Yemen, was carefully parched or roasted to ensure it could never be planted elsewhere. It was a gentle, quiet form of trade protectionism. The monopoly was eventually broken by, you guessed it, the Dutch. They were the masters of gentle botanical espionage. The major commercial spread came when the Dutch managed to acquire a living plant and began cultivating it in their colonies in Indonesia, particularly Java. This is why coffee is often still colloquially called Java. The Dutch broke the monopoly with quiet, methodical efficiency, turning coffee from an expensive Arabian secret into a global commodity. By the mid-17th century, coffee had arrived in Europe and in force, and the coffee house quickly became the gentle, pulsing heart of urban life. In London, the first coffee house opened in 1650. By the early 1700s, there were literally hundreds of them scattered across the city. The coffee house was democratic and revolutionary in a very gentle way. The price was low, the air was clear, and there was a gentle rule of no rank. Merchants, scholars, poets, and politicians all mingled gently, sharing tables and opinions. The atmosphere fostered deep, focused conversation. People weren't stumbling over their words or falling asleep. They were sharp, alert, and ready to argue about philosophy or trade routes. This gentle surge of caffeine-fueled concentration is often cited as a contributing factor to the intellectual ferment of the Age of Enlightenment. Jonathan's Coffee House became the unofficial stock exchange. Lloyd's Coffee House became the definitive center for shipping insurance, the birthplace of what we now call Lloyd's of London. The entire structure of finance, insurance, and journalism in London was literally engineered on small, gentle cups of bitter dark liquid. The world was being run not by drunk aristocrats, but focused, penny-drinking urban professionals. The only people who truly hated the coffee house were, of course, the wine merchants, who saw their profits gently eroding, and the women of London, who complained in pamphlets that their husbands spent all their time and money arguing about politics instead of being at home. In 1675, King Charles II of England actually tried to gently ban coffee houses, claiming they were dens of sedition and places where people could quietly plot against the crown. The public outcry was so immediate and so vigorous that he was forced to gently rescind the proclamation a mere 11 days later. You just do not mess with the gentle focus of the English intellectual elite. Coffee, that quiet, dark stimulant, slowly replaced gin and ale as the drink of daily life, transforming the mental pace of Europe from a gentle, drunken stumble to a sharp, focused walk.
We have gently moved from the focus of a coffee buzz to another kind of sudden, profound mental shift, the utterly bizarre and entirely undramatic story of tulip mania in 17th century Holland. This is the history of a flower that briefly, and quite unnecessarily, became the most valuable commodity in the world. The tulip came from the Ottoman Empire and arrived in Western Europe around the mid-16th century. The tulip quickly became a symbol of status and wealth. The real madness, however, centered not on the ordinary, solid-colored tulip, but on the truly spectacular ones, those with streaked, flamed, or broken patterns, swirls of red, purple, and white. The gentle scientific truth behind these stunning patterns is that they were caused by a virus, the tulip breaking virus, which was spread by aphids. The virus weakened the bulb, but created a unique, temporary masterpiece of coloration. The Dutch didn't know it was a virus, they just saw divine perfection, and thus the value soared. By the 1630s, the tulip market had quietly moved from a simple botanical trade into a full-blown financial frenzy, mostly concentrated in the cities of Haarlem and Amsterdam. Here is where it gets gently ridiculous. People were no longer trading the flowers themselves. They were trading futures contracts for the bulbs that were still in the ground. During the summer, when the bulbs were dormant, buyers would purchase a slip of paper guaranteeing them ownership of a particular, named bulb when it was harvested. This created a purely speculative market. People who had never even seen the actual flower were buying and selling the contracts based on the expectation that someone else would pay even more for them later. A single contract for a rare bulb
could cost more than the income of 10 skilled craftsmen combined. In 1636, the price of a single viceroy bulb was allegedly exchanged for a gentle collection of commodities: 8 pigs, 4 oxen, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver cup. It was an absurdity of gentle excess. The buyers weren't just the wealthy elite, it was the entire middle class, bakers, weavers, chimney sweeps, who began liquidating their actual, tangible assets to invest in a flower bulb. They had convinced themselves that this time it was different. The gentle bubble reached its peak intensity in February 1637, and then, without any major external economic event, no war, no plague, no political turmoil, it quietly and suddenly burst. The trigger was undramatic. During a routine bulb auction in Harlem, the bidding suddenly stalled. A buyer hesitated, then another, and then the gentle spell was broken. People realized all at once that the prices were completely disconnected from the actual value of a flower bulb. The value was purely based on the expectation of a greater fool, and the greater fool had finally run out of money. Panic set in. Futures contracts that had been worth thousands of guilders one day were worth less the next. Everyone tried to sell at once, and there were no buyers. The result was a gentle, widespread economic disaster. Fortunes were wiped out. Legal battles raged for years because courts had no idea how to enforce contracts for items that were now worth nothing. Did you owe the promised payment or the current deflated value? The Dutch government eventually had to step in with a series of gentle, inconclusive legal rulings that essentially tried to pretend the whole thing never happened. Tulip mania wasn't a world-altering war, but it was a quiet, profound moment in history, the first widely documented example of a speculative financial bubble, a gentle lesson that human greed, when applied to something as inherently worthless as a single virus-ridden flower bulb, can create a frenzy and a collapse that are anything but gentle.
With the gentle, deflated crash of the tulip market echoing softly in the background, let's pivot to a single fascinating royal who embodied a different kind of gentle instability. Christina, Queen of Sweden. She was the 17th century monarch who simply decided that the gentle burden of being queen was utterly beneath her, so she quit. Christina was born in 1626, the daughter of King Gustavus Adolphus. Her father had gently arranged for her to receive the education of a male heir. She was brilliant, fiercely intelligent, and possessed an encyclopedic curiosity that was wildly inappropriate for a gentle, demure queen. She came of age during one of the most tumultuous periods in European history, but she governed with surprising effectiveness. Christina was, shall we say, a square peg in a gentle, royal round hole. She loathed the trappings of female royalty. She wore plain clothes, often men's boots, and refused to follow the gentle, fussy fashions of the court. She was utterly insomniac, famously working and studying deep into the night. She would often drag her exhausted, half-asleep courtiers out of bed at 4 a.m. for a philosophy debate. She brought René Descartes to Sweden, who, sadly, died of pneumonia within a year, likely due to Christina's demanding schedule of philosophical tutorials at 5 a.m. in the drafty royal library. It was a gentle, philosophical murder by climate. As she entered her 20s, Christina faced a gentle, relentless pressure to marry and produce an heir to secure the Vasa dynasty. This was the one essential task of a queen regnant. Christina, however, was fundamentally uninterested in marriage. Her primary conflict wasn't political. It was a deep, quiet battle between her brilliant,
masculine-trained intellect and the gentle, rigid gender roles of the 17th century. The crisis reached its quiet climax when Christina decided to convert to Catholicism. This was an astonishing, politically ruinous decision, as Sweden was the gentle, zealous heart of Protestantism. She didn't gently debate the conversion, she used it as the necessary pretext for the real goal, freedom. In 1654, at the age of 28, Christina shocked Europe by abdicating the throne in favor of her cousin. She didn't just step down, she put on men's clothing, rode across Europe, and eventually settled in Rome. The abdication was utterly unprecedented. Kings died in office, or they were gently overthrown. They did not simply resign because they wanted to read books and argue theology in a warmer climate. Christina lived out the rest of her life in Rome as a wealthy, independent eccentric. Let's drift over to her contemporary and arguably the most powerful monarch of his age, Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. We won't focus on his wars or his gentle political maneuvering, but on the quiet, debilitating disaster that was his mouth. Louis XIV created the image of absolute monarchy. His greatest, most expensive, and most gentle political maneuver was the construction of the Palace of Versailles. Versailles wasn't just a giant gold-plated home. It was a political cage. Louis XIV gently forced the entire French nobility to relocate from their provincial power bases to the court at Versailles. The whole thing, the entire system of French absolutism, was predicated on the glittering, perfect, divine image of the Sun King. The problem with creating a divine image is that reality has a nasty habit of interfering, particularly when it comes to dental hygiene in the 17th century. Louis XIV had notoriously bad teeth. His diet, which was incredibly rich in sugar, consumed in massive, gentle quantities in cakes, jams, and wine, led to rampant decay and chronic gum disease. The gentle, continuous pain from his rotting teeth began to affect his ability to perform the constant, gentle social duties required of the Sun King. When Louis XIV finally sought serious treatment, the solution for a bad tooth was always the same: extraction. Louis XIV endured countless extractions, many performed by amateur barber surgeons. The true, quiet horror occurred during the extraction of one of his upper molars. The surgeon was so forceful that he accidentally broke off a large chunk of his upper jawbone. This created a huge, gaping hole between his mouth and his nasal cavity.
We've gently swept the lead soldiers and the dead rat of Peter III's reign aside. Now we turn to the final, gentle disaster before the actual, non-sleepy revolution. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. We will ignore the guillotines and the popular fury and focus instead on the quiet, insidious financial ruin she represented. Marie Antoinette was born an Archduchess of Austria. Her marriage to the French Dauphin, later Louis XVI, in 1770, was a purely political arrangement. She arrived in France at age 14, untrained for the intense, complex, and gently hostile atmosphere of the Versailles court. The French court was a nest of gentle vipers, and the young Austrian princess was constantly under scrutiny. The core of Marie Antoinette's quiet tragedy was her complete inability to grasp the profound financial and social crises slowly suffocating the French monarchy. Her only response to the pressure and the boredom of court life was to gently lean into extravagance. She became obsessed with fashion, which was her one form of self-expression. She employed the famed marchand de mode, Rose Bertin, creating utterly ludicrous hairstyles and costumes. Her most famous gentle absurdity was the pouf, a massive, towering hairstyle that could be 3 feet high. Her other great expense was the petit trianon,
a small chateau on the grounds of Versailles, gifted to her by Louis XVI. She transformed the surrounding park into the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's hamlet. This was a faux rustic, ridiculously expensive, fully functioning peasant village where the Queen and her closest friends could play act as gentle milkmaids and shepherdess. The cows had ribbons, and the milk buckets were made of porcelain. This gentle, elaborate play acting was the ultimate insult to a populace that was genuinely starving. While French peasants struggled to afford bread, the Queen was pretending to be a shepherdess in a bespoke, silk-lined cottage. The problem wasn't that the cost of her diamonds or dresses was the cause of the revolution. The royal family's spending on things like war and debt was exponentially larger. The gentle disaster was that Marie Antoinette's extravagance became the symbol of the monarchy's irresponsibility and detachment. The public perception, fueled by relentless, vicious libel pamphlets, was that she was single-handedly bankrupting the nation. She became known as Madame Deficit. Every new dress, every feathered poof, every throwaway comment, let them eat cake, which of course she never actually said, but the gentle rumor was enough, was quietly tallied by an angry populace. The French monarchy was already drowning in debt from the lavish spending of Louis XIV and the costs of the American Revolutionary War. Marie Antoinette's gentle, frivolous spending was merely the visible, glittering hemorrhage that convinced the public that the entire system was corrupt and beyond saving. Her tragedy in this gentle, slow-burn history is that she was a fundamentally shallow, well-meaning, but utterly clueless young woman who was simply given too much money and too much power at the precise moment her country could least afford it. She was the final, gentle puff of frivolous air before the dam of history burst. The gentle, quiet collapse of the French crown began long before the pitchforks appeared. It began with the slow, relentless financial hemorrhaging that the Queen's gentle lifestyle so perfectly symbolized.
Now, if you are still with me, let's gently pivot from the silent disaster of the French crown to the dusty, dry decay of ancient Egypt, specifically the curious, quiet history of the so-called Curse of Tutankhamun and the sensationalism that followed its discovery in the Valley of the Kings. The media frenzy began immediately, and because a simple, gentle story about archaeology is boring, the press needed drama. They didn't have to wait long. Lord Carnarvon, the man who funded the excavation and was the first to enter the burial chambers with Carter, died suddenly, just 5 months after the opening of the tomb in April 1923. Carnarvon's death was gentle but undignified. He was already in poor health, having suffered a severe car crash years earlier. He contracted a severe case of erysipelas, a bacterial skin infection after nicking a mosquito bite on his cheek while shaving. He developed pneumonia and died shortly thereafter. The gentle, sober truth is that an older man, recovering from an injury, succumbed to a common infection in a pre-antibiotic era. But the press, especially the perpetually melodramatic H.V. Morton of the Daily Express, saw a better narrative, the curse. The story was immediately embellished with dramatic, gentle details. The precise moment Carnarvon died, the lights in Cairo supposedly flickered and went out. Cairo power grids in 1923 were notoriously unreliable, so this was likely a gentle coincidence. Back in England, Carnarvon's beloved dog, Susie, supposedly howled and dropped dead at the exact same time. A tragic but gentle coincidence involving an old dog. The journalists invented the core element of the story, an inscription on the tomb promising terrible vengeance on anyone who disturbed the pharaoh's rest. The catch: no such clear, dramatic inscription was ever found. The actual inscriptions were standard ancient Egyptian funerary prayers,
gentle wishes for the deceased. But the story was too good. The public loved the idea of a gentle, ancient spirit guarding its gold. Over the next few years, other people associated with the expedition died, which was inevitable given the number of people involved, the primitive state of medicine, and the advanced age of some participants. George J. Gold, an American financier who visited the tomb, died of pneumonia. Archibald Douglas Reed, who x-rayed the mummy, died of a gentle, unknown illness. The press kept gentle, meticulous tabs on every associated death, ignoring the hundreds of people, Egyptian workers, journalists, family members, and scientists who lived long, healthy lives. The true, boring statistic is that the majority of those who were in the immediate primary group that entered the tomb lived into old age. Howard Carter himself, the gentle chief offender, lived until 1939, dying a quiet death at age 64 from lymphoma. The curse had a mortality rate significantly lower than just living in 1920s Cairo. The gentle curse of Tutankhamun remains one of the greatest pieces of archaeological fiction. It's a prime example of how the media, faced with a complex, slow-moving reality, will always choose the gentle, dramatic path of supernatural disaster to sell a few more papers. Let's now drift across the channel to the gentle, troubled reign of King George III of Great Britain, reigned 1760 to 1820. Known today primarily for losing the American colonies and his descent into his gentle, famous madness, we're going to focus on a quiet, humiliating, and persistent physical ailment that likely contributed to his misery: his relentless, debilitating urinary problems. George III was a long-reigning monarch whose life was characterized by a relentless series of gentle, psychological, and political disasters. He was the king who lost America, a gentle, massive political failure that he took deeply personally. But the real focus of our gentle history is the recurring bouts of what was famously called his madness: episodes of confusion, agitation, foaming at the mouth, speaking non-stop, and sometimes unfortunate outbursts of royal violence.
For centuries, the gentle diagnosis for George III's recurring illness was straightforward: mental derangement, or perhaps a touch of inherited madness. However, in the late 20th century, a much more prosaic yet fascinating gentle cause was proposed: porphyria. Porphyria is not a mental illness, it's a gentle group of rare genetic disorders that affect the nervous system and the skin. The symptoms of an acute attack of porphyria are a gentle, terrifying catalog of medical horrors. Psychiatric symptoms, the madness, severe abdominal pain, and, crucially for our story, discolored urine, often turning reddish-purple due to the excess porphyrins. This diagnosis is strongly supported by historical records of his symptoms, and the reddish-purple urine is the gentle chemical signature of the disease. Now, let's connect the genetic dots to the personal, gentle humiliation. One of the common, cruel side effects of acute porphyria is its effect on the autonomic nervous system, which controls involuntary functions like the heartbeat, breathing, and the bladder. The historical accounts of George III during his gentle bouts of illness are filled with references to his severe urinary retention, inability to empty the bladder, or conversely, painful incontinence, involuntary urination. Imagine being the sovereign of the most powerful empire in the world, having to perform the gentle, constant, public rituals of a monarch while being in agonizing pain and constantly struggling to pass water, or struggling not to. During one of his most severe episodes, his doctors, a group of gentle, well-meaning, but utterly clueless men,
resorted to brutal, unsterile methods to try and relieve his bladder distress, including the repeated insertion of metal catheters. Given the primitive state of 18th century hygiene, these procedures almost certainly led to bladder infections and possibly sepsis, exacerbating both his physical and mental agony. The result was a king who was not just politically defeated and genetically cursed, but who was in constant, agonizing pain and subject to the profound, gentle humiliation of losing control over his own body's basic functions. The gentle, quiet tragedy of George III, the man who was meant to be the living symbol of Britain's power, is that he was slowly, relentlessly undone by a faulty gene, a painful bladder, and the inability of 18th century science to gently diagnose his condition. He spent the last decade of his reign in physical and mental darkness, a sad, broken, and gently incontinent symbol of royal fragility. We have finished with the gentle, miserable urinary tract of King George III. Now, for our next historical drift, let's consider an object so mundane, so universal, that we barely think about it, yet it is arguably the most profoundly disruptive invention in human history: the mechanical clock. We are talking about the moment humanity stopped living by the gentle rhythm of the sun and started living by the relentless, entirely artificial ticking of the minute hand. For almost all of human history, time was flexible and situational. People woke up with the sun, went to sleep when it was dark, and measured the day by simple events. The length of an hour varied wildly. The ancient Romans and medieval Europeans often used temporal hours, meaning the daylight period was divided into 12 hours and the nighttime into 12 hours. In winter, the daylight hours were short. In summer, they were long. An hour in June was significantly longer than an hour in December. Time was gentle and fluid, adapting to the solar cycle.
The gentle internal clock was the primary mechanism of life. This all began to change with the slow, clunky rise of the mechanical public clock. The earliest true mechanical clocks, which began appearing in European monasteries and cathedrals in the late 13th century, were not invented to tell people when to get to work. They were invented to tell monks when to pray. Monastic life was structured around the canonical hours. Precision was necessary to maintain the opus Dei, the work of God. These clocks were massive, complex devices made of iron, and they were generally placed in towers where their gentle, resounding chime could be heard across the entire town. The sound of the bell, the signal for the monks to pray, was the first step in imposing a standardized external time on the general population. By the 15th and 16th centuries, mechanical clocks became more accurate and started moving from the church tower into public squares and eventually into the homes of the wealthy. The invention of the pendulum clock by Christian Huygens in 1656 drastically improved accuracy, finally allowing for the consistent measurement of the minute. This seemingly gentle technical improvement was a profound societal shift. Before the minute hand, it was fine to be around mid-morning. After the minute hand, suddenly you could be 10 minutes late. The minute hand introduced the concept of wasted time. Time became a commodity, a resource that could be measured, saved, or squandered. This was absolutely essential for the next gentle historical movement, the Industrial Revolution. You cannot run a factory on temporal hours or on the gentle rhythm of the sun. You need your workforce to arrive at the precise same moment. You need to measure work and pay
in standardized, gentle increments of time. You need the trains to run on a predictable, published schedule. The clock imposed a relentless, unforgiving discipline on the workforce. Time was no longer a natural phenomenon. It was a tool of production. Life became rigidly compartmentalized: work time, meal time, sleep time. This is the origin of the gentle, constant, low-grade anxiety we all feel about being late or about deadlines. We are all living under the quiet, continuous tyranny of the minute hand, a tyranny first imposed by a 13th century monk trying to figure out when to start Vespers. The gentle final irony is that today we carry the clock with us everywhere. It is in our pocket, on our wrist, and embedded in every screen we look at. The very thing that was invented to standardize public life, to bring communities together for prayer or work, has now become an intensely personal, private anxiety generator. We are now more separated from the gentle flow of solar time than ever before, enslaved to an entirely manufactured precision that dictates everything from our sleep cycle to our digital appointments. Now, let's pivot back to royalty, specifically the Victorian era, but we are going to ignore the empire and the gentle march of industrialization. Instead, we will focus on the quiet, personal disaster of Queen Victoria after the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, and how she gently weaponized her grief to reshape royal life. When the young Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, the British monarchy was not exactly a glamorous institution. It was generally viewed as a slightly expensive, gently ridiculous relic. Prince Albert, her first German cousin whom she married in 1840, was instrumental in changing this. He was earnest, brilliant, pious, and obsessed with propriety and duty. Albert and Victoria spent the next 2 decades creating the image of the perfect, gentle middle-class family. Hard-working, moral, and utterly devoted to each other and their 9 children. This quiet, domestic rebranding worked. It gave the monarchy a moral legitimacy it hadn't enjoyed in centuries.
Then came the gentle, quiet disaster that redefined the monarchy: the death of Prince Albert in December 1861. Albert was only 42 years old. His death was officially attributed to typhoid fever. Victoria was utterly, profoundly destroyed by his loss. Her grief wasn't a private, gentle affair. It was a decades-long public performance that changed the entire fabric of British royal life. Victoria decided that the only way to express the gentle depth of her sorrow was to adopt perpetual mourning. For the remaining 40 years of her life, Victoria wore nothing but black. She was a living, breathing, gentle symbol of perpetual sorrow. The vibrant colors and gentle opulence of court life were immediately and permanently replaced by somber, heavy black crepe and lace. She gently sealed off many of Albert's rooms in their various residences, preserving them as they were when he died, creating a series of quiet, emotional mausoleums. The entire mood of the royal residences shifted from bustling family life to a state of hushed, reverential grief. She virtually vanished from public life for years, retreating into seclusion at Osborne and Balmoral. She refused to attend many state functions, opening of Parliament, or public parades. This was a gentle political gamble. At first, the public sympathized with the grieving widow. But as the years turned into decades, the gentle sympathy curdled into quiet political resentment. People began to grumble about the widow of Windsor, an expensive, self-pitying figure who neglected her gentle public duties. Victoria, however, was a monarch of gentle, immovable will. She used her grief not as a weakness, but as a weapon to reinforce the moral authority of the crown.
Her perpetual mourning became the gentle visual expression of the era's sentimentality and moral seriousness. By being the ultimate sickly queen, always sad, always suffering, always morally correct, she demanded a new kind of quiet respect from her subjects. It was a respect born not of opulence or conquest, but of sympathy. She transformed the image of the monarchy from one of frivolous excess to one of moral, gentle endurance. She redefined royal duty. It was no longer about glittering public appearances. It was about the moral example, the quiet, constant, tearful devotion to duty, even in the face of immense personal tragedy. It was a brilliant, profoundly sad, and entirely gentle political maneuver that secured the crown's future, even as it smothered the court in black crape for 4 decades. With the gentle, perpetual silence of mourning hanging over Victorian England, let's pivot to a different kind of perpetual quiet. The story of the man in the iron mask, the gentle mystery that continues to confuse historians. This is a story about the ultimate erasure of identity and the gentle terror of absolute power during the reign of Louis XIV. The actual verifiable facts about the man in the mask are few, simple, and utterly undramatic. The man was arrested sometime around 1669 and was placed in the custody of a single, highly trusted jailer named Benin d'Avogène de Saint-Mars. Wherever Saint-Mars was posted, from the fortress of Pignerol in the Alps to the Bastille in Paris, the prisoner gently followed. The man was never separated from his single, gentle warder. The mask was not always made of iron, despite the famous name. It was more likely made of black velvet. The purpose of the mask was not to torture the man, but simply to conceal his identity from anyone who might see him, the guards, the doctors, the staff. It was a gentle, constant act of visual erasure. The prisoner died in the Bastille in 1703 and was buried the next day under the pseudonym Marchioli.
The gentle horror of this story is the sheer monotonous consistency. This was a man who lived under a permanent veil, isolated from all human contact except for his jailer, for over 34 years. His life was a silent, continuous question mark. The level of security and secrecy surrounding this single, non-violent prisoner was utterly unprecedented. It suggests that the man's identity was not just a political problem, but a dynastic secret that could destabilize the gentle divine authority of Louis XIV. The Minister of War, the Marquis de Louvois, corresponded frequently with Saint-Mars, issuing gentle, terrifyingly simple instructions. The prisoner was to be treated well, provided with good food and clean linen, as befitting a man of gentle birth. But if the prisoner ever attempted to reveal his identity, even a whisper, he was to be killed instantly. This combination of gentle comfort and immediate execution created a psychological cage far stronger than the fortress walls. The man was too important to kill outright, yet too dangerous to live with an open face. Because the facts are so few and the security was so absolute, the story has naturally spawned a library of theories, each more gentle and dramatic than the last. Alexandre Dumas's theory, the most dramatic, is that the prisoner is the king's identical twin brother, born a few hours after Louis XIV. To avoid a succession crisis, the infant was secretly raised in obscurity and later imprisoned. The foreign secretary theory, the most plausible, gently favored by many historians, suggests the man was an Italian diplomatic agent named Eustache d'Auger. He was involved in a massive, embarrassing financial scandal involving highly placed French officials and possibly even Louis XIV himself. His continued existence was less of a dynastic threat and more of a threat
to the gentle, delicate balance of court corruption. His imprisonment was designed to ensure he never revealed the names of his powerful co-conspirators. The elder brother theory holds that the man was the illegitimate or elder half-brother of Louis XIV. The secret of his true birth was so sensitive that revealing it would undermine the legitimacy of Louis's claim to the throne. The gentle, enduring significance of the man in the iron mask is not his actual identity, which will likely never be definitively proven. It is what he represents, the chilling, absolute power of an 18th century monarch to simply erase a person from history. He was a human being, denied even the most basic identifier, his name and his face. He was an administrative detail, a gentle problem that had to be contained indefinitely, without explanation or trial. The man in the iron mask is the quiet, perfect symbol of a history that is designed to be forgotten, a secret so profound it demanded a lifetime of gentle, muffled silence. Now, if you are still awake, let's gently transition from the final great secret of French absolutism to a quiet, modern problem, the gentle, eternal war between pets and plumbing, and the chaos our furry friends create in our engineered environments. We've gently closed the book on the silent tragedy of the man in the iron mask, the ultimate erased identity. Now let's bring our monologue right back to the modern, mundane world with a gentle, everyday disaster that silently haunts millions of homes, the quiet, continuous war between domestic pets and residential plumbing. This is a gentle history of things you rarely see until they stop working.
Our modern plumbing system, so carefully engineered to gently whisk waste away, presents a quiet, constant fascination for our pets, particularly dogs and cats. For a dog, the toilet bowl is the ultimate water fountain, a constant, fresh supply of cool water delivered at the perfect drinking height. It's a gentle, irresistible temptation. This gentle temptation leads to a predictable, messy conflict. While most of the issues are simple, gross facts of life, pets shedding hair, tracking mud, the real problems arise when the animals interact with the smaller, more fragile components of the system. The first line of gentle defense is the toilet itself. The flushing mechanism, specifically the flapper or float assembly, contains tiny, moving parts that can be gently and persistently chewed, knocked askew, or simply become clogged with shedding hair. A dog, in its gentle, tireless pursuit of a refreshing drink, will often inadvertently chew the vinyl flapper chain, causing the toilet to run continuously. This leads to a gentle, constant stream of wasted water and a higher than necessary water bill, a small, persistent financial drain caused by a moment of canine thirst. The even more dramatic yet gentle scenario is the dropped toy. A tiny smooth rubber ball, a slightly chewed dog biscuit, or a small action figure, don't ask, all find their way into the swirling vortex of the flush. Because the gentle curve of the siphon pipe is designed only for the easy passage of water and human waste, a small, hard object can become lodged there for decades, causing a low-grade, persistent clog that only reveals itself through a slow drain or a strange gurgling sound late at night. Cats, of course, approach plumbing problems with a much more gentle, sophisticated malice. Their primary weapon is hair. Cats shed constantly, and this hair, often ingested during fastidious grooming, forms gentle, dense little fur balls that are then politely deposited wherever the cat chooses to cough them up. If a cat chooses to perform this gentle transaction in the bathtub or the shower basin,
That hair, combined with soap scum and human hair, creates the ultimate gentle clog, a dense, sticky mat of biological debris that resists all but the most aggressive plumbing snake. The more gentle and insidious problem is the cat's lifelong affair with the draining pipe. A cat sees a hole in the floor, the drain, and immediately begins to gently bat things down it. This can be anything from tiny, shiny bottle caps to small, rubbery toy mice, or, most tragically, wadded up bits of cat litter tracked in from the box. Cat litter, even the gentle, flushable kind, is often a recipe for disaster in older, narrower pipes. It doesn't truly dissolve, it merely suspends itself, gently settling in horizontal sections of pipe until it creates a concrete-like blockage that requires a very grumpy plumber and an unfortunate amount of money to excavate. The external plumbing is not safe either. The most expensive yet silent war is fought underground in the gentle, moist soil of your yard. Tree roots are the #1 enemy of the sewer line, but dogs are a close second in terms of causing mild, persistent damage. The digging dog, a bored or anxious dog in its gentle pursuit of a mythical underground creature, will often dig near foundations or along the path of the main sewer line. If the line is shallow or the seal around the pipe is weak, the gentle pressure of the dog's persistent paws can create a slight shift in the pipe's alignment.
A slight shift is all it takes. Once the pipe is gently misaligned, the gentle flow of effluent slows, allowing solids to accumulate, and most importantly, giving the aforementioned tree roots an easy, accessible source of water and nutrients. The dog's gentle digging then becomes the first act in a years-long siege waged by nature on your home's foundation. The gentle, persistent presence of our beloved furry companions is a continuous, low-grade threat to the precise engineered perfection of modern home plumbing. They are a gentle, chaos-inducing factor in the domestic ecosystem, ensuring that the work of the plumber is never truly complete. And that, my friends, is a truly gentle, utterly unexciting disaster to end our long, sleepy monologue. Good night, and may your pipes run clear.